Doris Duke was a name Americans knew the way they knew the Rockefellers or the Vanderbilts. Not a person exactly, but a permanent fact of the national landscape, old money made visible. She inherited a tobacco fortune worth hundreds of millions, converted it into art, land, and architecture across 3 continents, and left behind a philanthropic foundation, still endowed with more than $2 billion. She survived 2 divorces, 7 decades of tabloid scrutiny, and every scandal that brushed against her. She preserved a city's colonial streetscape, built collections from Newport to Honolulu, and seemed like the kind of American whose wealth would simply outlast everything. And in October 1966, a man died under her car outside her Newport gates, and in 6 decades, no criminal proceeding has ever settled what happened. How does a woman whose fortune could preserve entire cities leave behind one death that all of that fortune could never resolve? On a Tuesday morning in October 1925, in a private room at the family's mansion on Fifth Avenue, James Buchanan Duke died of pneumonia. He was 68 years old. He left behind a wife named Nanaline, a 12-year-old daughter named Doris, and a fortune built on the American Tobacco Company that had, at its height, controlled roughly 90% of the cigarette market in the United States. The will was filed in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. The details reached New York within hours. The bulk of the estate, trusts, properties, and corporate holdings that contemporaneous reporting valued in the hundreds of millions, passed to Doris. Not gradually, not conditionally, not upon her majority, immediately in legal terms, though managed by trustees until she came of age. The child who had been ordinary to herself that morning, sheltered, motherless in practical terms, raised among staff, woke into a designation she would spend the rest of her life trying to outrun: the richest girl in the world. That phrase was not hers. It was a tabloid invention, a headline shorthand that collapsed a 12-year-old's bereavement into a public spectacle. But it stuck. It appeared in gossip columns, society pages, and wire service dispatches for the next 7 decades. And it did something specific to Doris Duke that would shape every relationship, every house, every institution, and every catastrophe that followed. It made her legible to the world before she was legible to herself. The fortune she inherited was not merely large. It was architectural. J.B. Duke had not simply accumulated wealth, he had built it into physical structures designed to outlast him. Duke Farms, the family's estate in Hillsborough, New Jersey, sprawled across more than 2,000 acres of manicured landscape, fountains, and conservatories. Rough Point, the Newport mansion overlooking the Atlantic, sat among the grandest of the Bellevue Avenue cottages. There was the New York residence. There were trust instruments and endowment structures that channeled tobacco profits into Duke University, Duke Power, and a network of hospitals and orphanages across the Carolinas. J.B. Duke had turned money into geography, and now his daughter lived inside that geography as both its owner and its ward. Nanaline Holt Duke, Doris's mother, was J.B.'s second wife, a woman of Southern society who understood the rules of wealth, but not necessarily the emotional needs of a girl who had just lost her father and gained a public identity simultaneously. The household after J.B.'s death was not chaotic. It was managed. Trustees oversaw the money. Staff oversaw the houses. Nanaline oversaw appearances. What no one oversaw, because no structure existed for it, was the internal life of a child who now understood, at 12, that adults would arrange themselves around her before any ordinary emotional negotiation ever had the chance to occur. That is the wound. Not a dramatic rupture, not abuse in the clinical sense, something quieter and, in the long run, more defining. The discovery, before adolescence, that money reorganizes every human relationship it touches, and that when the money is large enough, the reorganization is total. People came toward Doris Duke. They came with plans, with needs, with affection that was never entirely separable from the fortune that surrounded her like weather. She learned this early. She never fully unlearned it. And the architecture of her life, the houses, the staff, the foundations, the lawyers, the acquisitions, the adoptions, the one death at the gate that would shadow everything, can be understood as a series of attempts to manage a world in which intimacy and transaction had been fused before she was old enough to know the difference. By the time Doris Duke reached her late teens, the properties she had inherited were not merely residences. They were a system. Duke Farms in New Jersey was the pastoral anchor, vast, walled, attended by groundskeepers and horticulturists who maintained its gardens with the seriousness of a botanical institution. Rough Point in Newport was the social theater, a Gilded Age mansion on the cliffs where the old money families performed their rituals of summer. The Fifth Avenue house in Manhattan was the urban stage. Each property had its own staff, its own rhythms, its own version of Doris. To move between them was not simply to travel, it was to shift personae, to inhabit different architectures of expectation. The houses also functioned as enclosure. A young woman whose face appeared in newspapers, whose name appeared on lists of eligible heiresses, whose fortune was public knowledge, could not simply walk into the world. The world walked toward her, and the houses were the structures that regulated the approach. Visitors were received, staff mediated, trustees advised. The effect, whether intended or not, was a life lived at one remove from ordinary social friction and ordinary social learning. Nanaline managed the social calendar with precision. She understood that her daughter's position required visibility without vulnerability, presence without overexposure. Doris attended the expected events. She was presented to society. She appeared in the expected photographs. But the record of these years, such as it survives in archival summaries and later profiles, suggests a young woman who was compliant rather than enthusiastic. Someone who understood that the performance was required without ever quite believing it was the point. What she did believe in, or at least what she gravitated toward, was control over physical space. Even in her teens, Doris showed an instinct for acquisition and arrangement that went beyond decorating. She was interested in how things were built, how gardens were designed, how collections were assembled, how a room could be made to do something other than simply house furniture. That instinct, the impulse to shape environment rather than merely inhabit it, would eventually produce genuine cultural contributions. But it also carried the signature of the wound. If people could not be trusted to remain stable, houses could. If relationships reorganized themselves around money, then the money was better spent on objects, structures, and institutions that would hold their shape. Duke Farms, in particular, became an early canvas. The estate's conservatories, gardens, and grounds were already substantial when Doris inherited them. Over the following decades, she would expand and reimagine the property repeatedly, adding collections of orchids, redesigning landscapes, importing specimens, and eventually steering the entire estate toward a conservation mission that would outlast her. But the impulse began here, in the years when the houses were still more powerful than the girl who owned them. In 1935, at 22, Doris Duke married James H.R. Cromwell, a politician and socialite whose ambitions were civic and whose attraction to the Duke fortune was, by most accounts, not entirely separable from his attraction to Doris herself. The marriage lasted 6 years. It produced no children and ended in a 1943 divorce that, like most events in Doris Duke's life, was absorbed into the machinery of lawyers and trustees without much public mess. But the marriage mattered structurally. It was the first of Doris Duke's attempts to convert inherited status into chosen identity, to be someone's wife, rather than everyone's heiress. And when it failed, it confirmed something she may already have suspected, that the fortune made ordinary partnership nearly impossible, because the fortune was always the third presence in the room, and the third presence was larger than either of the other two. After Cromwell, Duke did something unexpected. She went to work. In 1945, as the war was ending, she took a position as a foreign correspondent for the International News Service, filing dispatches from Europe. The job was real. She traveled, she reported, she submitted copy. Even if the access that got her the position was inseparable from the name that preceded her everywhere. What matters for the arc of the life is that she tried. She was not content to be curated. She wanted to act in the world under terms that were at least partially her own, and journalism was one attempt to find those terms. It was also during these years that she began the project that would become Shangri-La, her estate in Honolulu. Inspired by a honeymoon trip through the Islamic world with Cromwell in 1935, she had begun acquiring Islamic art and architectural elements, and by the late 1930s, she was building a residence on the coast of Oahu that would house the collection. Shangri-La was not a dilettante's folly. Over the following decades, it grew into one of the most significant collections of Islamic art in private hands in the United States. And Duke's engagement with the material was serious, sustained, and informed by direct relationships with dealers, scholars, and craftsmen across the Middle East and South Asia. This is where the biography resists the easy reading. The tabloid version of Doris Duke, eccentric heiress, reclusive rich woman, future suspect, flattens a figure who was, in her 20s and 30s, genuinely building things. She was learning languages, traveling independently, acquiring not just objects, but expertise, and converting inherited wealth into cultural production that had real scholarly and aesthetic value. The houses she was assembling were not simply refugees from the world. They were arguments about taste, about preservation, about what American money could do when it was directed by a mind that took beauty seriously. Her second marriage, to the Dominican diplomat and playboy Porfirio Rubirosa in 1947, lasted barely a year. Rubirosa was famous for his charm and for the wealthy women he courted. The marriage confirmed again that Doris Duke's fortune distorted the field around her, making it nearly impossible to distinguish genuine connection from strategic proximity. She emerged from it richer in experience and poorer in trust, and the pattern deepened. The houses became more important, the human connections more guarded, the inner circle smaller and more dependent on her resources. By the early 1950s, Doris Duke was in her late 30s. She had been divorced twice. She had no children. She had properties on 3 continents, a growing collection of art, a foundation beginning to take shape, and a reputation that was part legend, part gossip, and part genuine cultural accomplishment. She was not yet the figure the tabloids would later reduce her to. She was something more interesting and more difficult. A woman of real capability and real wealth who was discovering, property by property and relationship by relationship, that the fortune her father built was not just her inheritance, but her atmosphere, the medium through which she experienced everything, and which made certain kinds of human experience permanently unavailable. By the late 1950s, Doris Duke had begun converting private wealth into public architecture, with a deliberation that went beyond ordinary philanthropy. She was not simply writing checks. She was building instruments, institutions designed to outlast her, shaped by her specific tastes and embedded in the physical landscapes she controlled. The Duke Endowment, established by her father in 1924, was already one of the largest charitable trusts in the country, funding hospitals, orphanages, and universities across the Carolinas. But Doris was building her own parallel structure. At Shangri-La, the Islamic art collection continued to grow, acquiring pieces of genuine museum quality, Iznik tiles, Mughal period textiles, Moroccan architectural elements installed as functional parts of the house itself, so that the building and the collection were inseparable. In Newport, she was not yet the city's most prominent preservationist, but the groundwork was being laid. A growing attention to the fate of historic buildings, a deepening engagement with the architectural heritage of a city that old money was beginning to abandon. And at Duke Farms, the transformation was accelerating. The estate's greenhouses and gardens, already impressive, were becoming a serious horticultural operation. Duke imported plant specimens, experimented with conservation techniques, and began treating the property less as a private garden and more as a living laboratory. The scale was extraordinary, more than 2,000 acres of managed landscape, with resources that most public botanical institutions could not match. What drove this? The cynical reading is control, that a woman who could not master human relationships mastered objects and environments instead. The more generous reading is vocation, that Doris Duke had genuine aesthetic intelligence, genuine environmental instincts, and the means to act on them at a scale most people never approach. The accurate reading holds both. The same temperament that made her formidable as a collector and patron, the precision, the insistence on quality, the willingness to spend years on a single acquisition or restoration, also made her formidable as an employer, a landlord, and eventually a figure around whom darker events would orbit. The money that preserved Islamic tiles and Newport streetscapes also preserved a social architecture in which Doris Duke was always the center, always the patron, and everyone else was to some degree staff. Eduardo Tirella entered that architecture in the late 1950s. A designer, decorator, and artistic collaborator, Tirella was a World War II veteran with a gift for visual arrangement and an eye that Duke trusted. Over the following years, he became one of the most important figures in her domestic world, the person who arranged her houses, advised her acquisitions, and occupied a role that was part employee, part confidant, and part creative partner. The relationship was intimate in the sense that mattered most to Doris Duke. Tirella understood her taste, worked inside her houses, and had access to the private architecture that most people never saw. He was also, by the mid-1960s, growing restless. Tirella had ambitions beyond decorating for a single patron. He had connections in Hollywood, aspirations toward production design, and a professional life that was beginning to strain against the gravitational pull of Doris Duke's orbit. That tension, between a man trying to leave and a woman whose entire world was organized around making departure difficult, is the structural setup for the darkest chapter in the story. But that chapter belongs to the shadow. For now, in the early 1960s, the system was still holding. Doris Duke was in her late 40s, wealthy beyond ordinary comprehension, surrounded by houses that doubled as cultural institutions, attended by a circle of employees and associates whose livelihoods depended on her continued patronage, and building a record of philanthropy and preservation that was, by any reasonable standard, genuinely impressive. The legend was real. The money was doing real things. The houses were becoming real institutions, and Eduardo Tirella was still alive. By 1965, Doris Duke had spent 4 decades converting inheritance into institution, and the results were no longer debatable. They were physical. They occupied acreage, employed staff, and held collections that scholars traveled to study. Shangri-La, on the coast of Oahu, had become a destination in its own right, not yet open to the public in any formal sense, but known among curators and dealers as one of the finest collections of Islamic art assembled by a private individual in the Western Hemisphere. The house itself was part of the argument. Duke had not simply hung art on walls. She had built rooms around the art, incorporating Iznik tilework, Syrian interiors, and Mughal architectural fragments into the structure, so that crossing a threshold meant entering a different century and a different civilization. The commitment was not decorative. It was architectural and intellectual, sustained across 3 decades of acquisition, travel, and correspondence with scholars and craftsmen from Morocco to India. In Newport, Duke's engagement with the city's built heritage was deepening into something systematic. She had watched, through the 1950s and early 1960s, as the great Bellevue Avenue mansions aged, as families sold or demolished properties, as the architectural record of the Gilded Age began to thin. Her response was not sentimental. It was strategic. She was acquiring properties, funding restorations, and beginning to assemble the infrastructure that would become, in 1968, the Newport Restoration Foundation, an organization that would eventually restore and maintain more than 80 colonial-era buildings in the city. That foundation still operates today. The buildings still stand. The preservation was real. At Duke Farms, the horticultural operation continued to expand. The estate's greenhouses held orchid collections of national significance. The grounds were managed with the rigor of a research station. Duke was already beginning to articulate an environmental philosophy, the idea that the estate should serve as a model for land stewardship, not merely as a private garden, that would define the property's identity long after her death, and the philanthropy extended beyond her own properties. Through the Doris Duke Foundation and a network of trusts and direct gifts, she funded medical research, child welfare, the performing arts, and environmental conservation. The lifetime total, adjusted for inflation, exceeded $400 million. That is not a footnote. That is a legacy large enough to reshape neighborhoods, fund research programs, and sustain institutions across decades. The Doris Duke Foundation remains endowed today with assets exceeding $2 billion. Here is where the documentary must hold its nerve. It would be easy, knowing what comes next, to treat this establishment section as setup, as a facade waiting to be pulled back. But the establishment was not a facade. The preservation was genuine. The collections were serious. The philanthropy was consequential. Doris Duke built things that lasted, and she built them with competence, taste, and a scale of investment that most public institutions could not match. The woman who would be connected to a death at her own gate was also the woman who saved Newport's colonial streetscape. Both things operated simultaneously, inside the same life, powered by the same fortune, and neither one cancels the other. That is the thesis taking shape beneath the surface. Money, in sufficient quantity, does not merely enable choices. It becomes the medium through which a person relates to the world. And in that medium, generosity and control, preservation and possession, public good and private architecture can coexist without ever resolving into a single legible character. Doris Duke, at the height of her powers, was not a saint or a villain. She was something the American inheritance system occasionally produces and never quite knows how to assess, a person whose resources made ordinary moral categories feel inadequate. Eduardo Tirella was born in 1926 in Dover, New Jersey, served in the Army during the Second World War, and came home with an eye for design that would carry him into the orbit of one of the wealthiest women in the country. By the late 1950s, he was working for Doris Duke, arranging interiors, advising on acquisitions, traveling with her between properties, and occupying a position that had no clean job title because it crossed every boundary between professional service and personal intimacy. Tirella was not a servant in the traditional sense. He was a collaborator. Duke trusted his taste, relied on his judgment about objects and spaces, and gave him a role in the household that placed him closer to the center of her private world than almost anyone else. He helped shape the look of Rough Point. He worked on projects at Duke Farms. He was part of the daily texture of her life in a way that employees, in the conventional sense, rarely are. But the relationship carried the structural imbalance that defined all of Duke's closest connections. Tirella was talented, but his livelihood and his access depended on Duke's continued patronage. He lived, in professional terms, inside her architecture, and by the mid-1960s, that architecture had begun to feel like confinement. Tirella had ambitions in Hollywood. He had connections in the film and design communities on the West Coast, and he was pursuing opportunities that would take him outside Duke's orbit, work that had nothing to do with arranging her houses and everything to do with building a career of his own. According to later reporting, including Peter Lance's investigations published in Vanity Fair in 2020 and 2021, Tirella had come to Newport in October 1966, intending to tell Duke that he was leaving her employ to pursue work in Los Angeles. The visit was meant to be a farewell. What makes this structurally devastating is the pattern it fits. Doris Duke's entire life had been organized around a central problem. People came toward her because of the fortune, and the fortune made it nearly impossible to know whether any relationship was independent of it. Tirella was one of the few people who occupied a genuinely intimate position in her world, not a spouse angling for a settlement, not a trustee managing assets, but a creative partner whose value was aesthetic and personal. His departure would not merely cost her an employee, it would remove one of the few people who had seen the inside of her life and chosen to stay. And now he was choosing to leave. The evening of October 6, 1966, Tirella and Duke were at Rough Point. The next day, October 7th, would become the most consequential date in both their lives, and the most contested single event in the long, strange biography of Doris Duke. On the afternoon of October 7, 1966, Eduardo Tirella was struck and killed by a rented station wagon driven by Doris Duke outside the gates of Rough Point in Newport, Rhode Island. The basic physical facts are not in dispute. Tirella had gotten out of the car to open the estate's heavy iron gates. Duke was behind the wheel. The car moved forward, struck Tirella, dragged him, and continued across Bellevue Avenue, where it came to rest against a tree on the opposite side of the road. Tirella was dead. Duke was alive. The gates were the last threshold he ever crossed. What happened inside those seconds, whether the car lurched accidentally, whether Duke lost control, whether the act was deliberate, is the question that has defined the case for 6 decades, and it has never been answered with finality. Newport police responded and quickly accepted Duke's account. She told investigators that the car's transmission had malfunctioned, that the vehicle had moved forward on its own, that she had been unable to stop it. The police investigation was brief. No inquest was convened. The case was classified as an accident. Within days, the official machinery had processed Eduardo Tirella's death into a closed file. The speed of that closure is where the story begins to fracture. Later reporting, most substantially, Peter Lance's Vanity Fair investigations published in 2020 and 2021, argued that the physical evidence, the distance the car traveled, the injuries Tirella sustained, the trajectory across the road, was inconsistent with a simple transmission failure. Lance's reporting cited previously undisclosed witness accounts and alleged that Newport police had been influenced by Duke's wealth and her social position in the community. According to those investigations, the case file was incomplete, key evidence was not preserved, and the investigation's brevity was itself evidence of institutional deference to the most powerful person in the room. What must be held clearly is the distinction between what was established and what was alleged. The official finding was accidental death. A subsequent wrongful death civil suit brought by Tirella's family found Duke negligent, not criminally liable, but civilly responsible. The family received $75,000, a figure that, even adjusted for the era, was modest relative to Duke's fortune. Duke was never criminally charged. In 2021, Newport police reopened their review of the case after additional witness material surfaced, then closed it again without altering the original finding. The murder theory, that Duke deliberately ran Tirella down because he was leaving her, is serious, sourced reporting, not tabloid invention. But it remains, in legal and evidentiary terms, a theory. No prosecutor ever brought charges. No jury ever rendered a verdict. The decisive physical evidence from 1966 was not preserved with the rigor that a contested case would require. And Duke, who denied wrongdoing for the rest of her life, is not here to be cross-examined. What the record does establish, beyond dispute, is this. A man died under Doris Duke's car outside her gates at a moment when he was trying to leave her world. The official system processed that death with extraordinary speed. The woman whose wealth had shaped Newport's civic life for decades was never required to answer for it in a criminal proceeding. And the gap between what was declared and what was possible has never been closed. That gap is not a weakness in the documentary. It is the documentary's engine. The power of the Tirella case does not depend on proving murder. It depends on the structural observation that sits at the center of Doris Duke's entire life. When wealth reaches a certain scale, it does not merely purchase comfort or influence. It alters the field in which truth is established. It changes what gets investigated, how thoroughly, by whom, and with what conclusion. Eduardo Tirella died in that field, and the field held its shape. Within 2 years of Eduardo Tirella's death, Doris Duke became Newport's most visible civic benefactor. The sequence is documented and undisputed. In the months and years following October 1966, Duke made substantial financial contributions to Newport institutions. She funded restoration work on the Cliff Walk, the oceanfront path that runs along the base of the Great Estates. She gave to Newport Hospital. She supported local civic projects with the quiet, persistent generosity of someone who understood that money, directed steadily into a small city's infrastructure, accumulates not just gratitude, but insulation. Then, in 1968, she founded the Newport Restoration Foundation. The organization's mission was the preservation and restoration of Newport's colonial-era buildings, the 18th-century houses and structures that predated the Gilded Age mansions and were, by the 1960s, falling into disrepair or facing demolition. Over the following decades, the foundation would acquire and restore more than 80 buildings, creating a preserved colonial district that became one of the defining features of Newport's identity. The preservation work was real. The restored buildings still stand. The Newport Restoration Foundation still operates. Architectural historians credit the organization with saving a significant portion of Newport's pre-revolutionary building stock. This is not disputed by anyone. What is also not disputed, because it was observed and discussed by Newport residents for decades, is the timing. A woman connected to a man's death on Bellevue Avenue became, within 24 months, the single most important private benefactor of the city's built heritage. The civic memory of Eduardo Tirella did not vanish because it was suppressed. It receded because it was overlaid by bricks, by restorations, by institutional presence, by the steady structural reality of a foundation that employed people, maintained properties, and gave the city something tangible and valuable in exchange for something that could never be fully articulated in public. The film must hold both truths without collapsing either one. The philanthropy was not a bribe. It was too sustained, too substantive, and too deeply connected to Duke's genuine preservation instincts to be reduced to a transaction. But the philanthropy also cannot be separated from the context in which it arrived. A woman who might have faced harder questions chose instead to become indispensable. A city that might have pressed harder chose instead to accept what was offered. And over time, the buildings became the story, and Tirella became a footnote. This is the pattern the script has been building toward since Chapter 1. Money as medium. Not money as a tool used occasionally to solve problems, but money as the atmosphere in which problems dissolve, questions lose their urgency, and the distance between an event and its consequences stretches until the connection becomes nearly invisible. Doris Duke did not, so far as the record shows, sit in a room and calculate that philanthropy would erase a death. She did not need to calculate. She lived inside a system in which generosity and self-protection operated along the same channels, and the system did its work, whether she directed it consciously or not. Eduardo Tirella's family received $75,000. Newport received a foundation that reshaped its skyline. The distance between those two figures is the measure of something the legal system was never designed to name. After the Tirella case closed and the Newport Restoration Foundation opened, Doris Duke entered a long middle period that the public record renders as philanthropy, and the private record renders as something less coherent. She was, through the 1970s and into the 1980s, still building, still collecting, still funding. The external architecture of her life, the houses, the foundations, the civic presence, remained impressive, even admirable. But the internal architecture, so far as those close to her later described it, was shifting. The pattern that had organized her entire life, money as medium, staff as intermediary, houses as the stable structures that people could not be, did not soften with age. It deepened. The inner circle contracted. The relationships that remained were increasingly dependent on Duke's resources, which meant they were increasingly shaped by the same structural imbalance that had defined every intimate connection she had ever attempted. People entered her orbit because the orbit offered something: employment, access, proximity to wealth, and the terms of that entry made genuine equality impossible. This is not speculation dressed as analysis. The court records, estate litigation documents, and later reporting that would emerge after Duke's death describe a household in which loyalty and dependence were difficult to distinguish, in which Duke's generosity could be withdrawn as swiftly as it was extended, and in which the line between employment and companionship had been erased so thoroughly that the people closest to her were also the people most vulnerable to her displeasure. The houses continued to function as instruments. Rough Point remained the Newport anchor, its rooms still arranged to Duke's specifications, its grounds still maintained, its place in the city's social geography still defined by the fortune that sustained it. Duke Farms continued its evolution toward environmental stewardship. Shangri-La's collection continued to grow. Falcon Lair, the Bel Air estate once owned by Rudolph Valentino, became another node in the network, a Los Angeles residence that placed Duke within reach of the entertainment and social world she intermittently engaged. But the engagement was increasingly on her terms, through her structures, mediated by her staff. The woman who had once tried on identities, correspondent, wife, traveler, collector, was now, by her 60s and 70s, living almost entirely inside the architecture she had built. Visitors came to her. She did not go to them. The houses received, the world approached, and Doris Duke remained at the center, attended, preserved, and progressively more isolated by the same fortune that made the preservation possible. In 1985, Doris Duke met Chandi Hefner, a woman in her early 30s with an interest in Hare Krishna spirituality and a manner that Duke reportedly found compelling. Within 3 years, the relationship had escalated to a point that stunned even those accustomed to the unpredictable rhythms of Duke's personal life. In 1988, Doris Duke legally adopted Chandi Hefner. The heiress was 75, the adoptee was 35. The adoption was extraordinary on its face, but it was also structurally legible within the logic of Duke's life. She had no biological children. Her 2 marriages had ended without producing heirs. The fortune, the houses, the collections, the foundations, the trusts, needed a successor, or at least someone who could be designated as one. And Doris Duke, who had spent 7 decades watching people arrange themselves around her money, chose to solve the succession problem by converting a companion into a daughter through the legal system. The transaction was emotional, but the instrument was a court filing. For a time, it appeared to work. Hefner was brought into the household. She traveled with Duke. She was introduced as Duke's daughter. She stood, for a brief period, as the presumptive heir to one of the largest private fortunes in American history. Then it collapsed. By the early 1990s, the relationship had deteriorated. Duke moved to disinherit Hefner with the same decisiveness she had shown in adopting her. Legal proceedings followed. According to reporting in Vanity Fair and in estate documents that became part of the public record after Duke's death, the reversal was complete. Hefner was cut out of the will, replaced in the succession plan, and left to fight for what she could recover through litigation. In 1995, Hefner settled her claim against the estate for $65 million, a substantial sum by any ordinary measure, but a fraction of the fortune she had briefly been positioned to inherit. The Hefner episode is not a sideshow. It is the wound made visible in its most unsettling form. Doris Duke turned motherhood itself into a transaction, an arrangement that could be executed by legal filing, sustained by proximity and patronage, and revoked when the arrangement no longer served its purpose. The adoption did not fail because Hefner was unworthy, or because Duke was cruel. It failed because it was built on the same structural foundation as every other relationship in Duke's life. Money as the medium, dependency as the bond, and the patron's prerogative as the governing law. When the patron's feelings changed, the structure had no independent weight to hold it together. Chandi Hefner had her own agency, her own calculations, and her own responsibility for how the relationship unfolded. The record does not cast her as a passive victim, but the record also does not permit the comfortable reading that the adoption was simply a rich woman's eccentricity. It was something colder, a demonstration that when wealth reaches the scale of Doris Duke's fortune, even the most fundamental human categories, parent, child, family, inheritance, become instruments of arrangement, deployable and retractable at will. By the late 1980s, the inner circle had contracted to a point that alarmed even longtime associates. The figure who emerged at its center was Bernard Lafferty, an Irish-born butler who entered Duke's employ in 1987 and rose over the following 6 years from domestic employee to the single most powerful individual in her personal world. Lafferty's trajectory defied every conventional expectation of household service. He was not a lawyer, a trustee, or a financial advisor. He was a butler, a man whose formal role was to manage the domestic operations of Duke's residences. But Duke's household was not conventional, and the role Lafferty came to occupy had no precedent in the architecture of the Duke fortune. By the early 1990s, according to court records and estate documents that became public during the litigation that followed Duke's death, Lafferty had become Duke's closest daily companion, her most trusted attendant, and the person with the most consistent access to her private life. He was also, by multiple accounts entered into the record during estate proceedings, a man with a serious alcohol problem. That detail is not incidental. It is structural. The person to whom Doris Duke granted the most intimate access and eventually the most consequential legal authority was someone whose own stability was compromised. The question the estate litigation would later raise: whether Lafferty's influence over Duke was benign companionship or something closer to manipulation of a vulnerable elderly woman, was never resolved with the clarity that any of the parties sought. What is documented is the legal outcome. In her final will, executed in April 1993, Doris Duke named Bernard Lafferty as co-executor of her estate, alongside the law firm of U.S. Trust. The will left the bulk of the fortune to the charitable foundations Duke had established during her lifetime. It left Lafferty a substantial personal bequest and placed him in a position of fiduciary authority over an estate valued at more than $1 billion. The will was contested almost immediately after Duke's death, and the litigation that followed would consume years. But the decisive events occurred before the will was filed, in the final months of Doris Duke's life, inside the rooms of Falcon Lair, where the contraction of her world reached its terminal point. In 1993, Doris Duke was 80 years old, and the body that had carried her through 8 decades of wealth, reinvention, and scandal was failing. She had been ill for months. The final phase of her life unfolded not in Newport, not at Duke Farms, not at Shangri-La, but in Beverly Hills, at Falcon Lair, and eventually at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, where the richest woman in America occupied a private suite attended by nurses, doctors, and the ever-present Bernard Lafferty. The court records from the estate litigation that followed her death contain descriptions of her condition in these final months that are difficult to reconcile with the scale of the fortune that surrounded her. A 1995 New York Times account of the proceedings described Duke, in April 1993, as feverish, emaciated, and suffering from what the report characterized as starvation. The richest woman in America was, according to testimony entered into the record, not eating. An Associated Press summary of related proceedings described a nurse's allegation that Duke had been subjected to what the nurse called a massive sedation regime, allegedly instigated by Lafferty. No criminal charges were ever brought in connection with these allegations. Lafferty denied wrongdoing. The medical professionals involved offered competing accounts. And the legal system, which would spend years parsing the estate, never produced a definitive finding on whether Duke's final care was adequate, negligent, or something worse. What the record permits is the observation, not the verdict. Doris Duke's final months were spent inside a shrinking perimeter. The private suite, the medical staff, the butler-turned-executor, the lawyers preparing or contesting documents. While the empire of houses and foundations she had built continued to operate outside, maintained by the institutional structures she had spent decades constructing. The woman who had shaped landscapes, preserved cities, and amassed one of the great private fortunes in American history ended her life in a room where power had migrated from the patient to the attendants, and where the resources that had once made ordinary limits optional could not prevent the most ordinary limit of all. Doris Duke died on October 28, 1993. Contemporaneous reporting identified the cause as pulmonary edema resulting in cardiac arrest. She was 80 years old. She had outlived 2 husbands, one adopted daughter's place in her will, one designer who died under her car, and several dozen lawyers. The fortune she left behind was valued at more than $1 billion. The legal struggle began almost immediately. Lafferty's appointment as co-executor was challenged. The validity of the final will was contested. Chandi Hefner's disinheritance became the subject of litigation. The institutions Duke had built, the foundations, the trusts, the properties, became arenas in which lawyers, trustees, and claimants fought over who would speak for a woman who could no longer speak for herself. The inheritance crisis that followed her death rhymed, with terrible precision, with the inheritance event that had begun her public life. In 1925, a 12-year-old girl became a fortune's ward. In 1993, a fortune became the ward of a court. The pattern was complete. The child who had been defined by an inheritance died, leaving behind another inheritance that would define the people who fought over it. The houses survived. That is the first thing to say, because it is true, and because Doris Duke built them to survive. Duke Farms operates today as a 2,700-acre center for environmental stewardship in Hillsborough, New Jersey. The estate's mission, as articulated by the Doris Duke Foundation, is land conservation, ecological research, and public education. The private garden became a public institution. The greenhouses, the orchids, the managed landscapes, all of it converted, after Duke's death, into something that serves a purpose beyond any single owner's taste. That conversion was not accidental. It was planned. Duke directed it. The intention was real. Rough Point, the Newport estate where Eduardo Tirella died outside the gates in 1966, is a museum. Visitors walk through rooms that Duke decorated, past objects she collected, along corridors that Tirella once arranged. The Newport Restoration Foundation still operates, still maintains more than 80 colonial-era buildings, still shapes the city's architectural identity. The preservation work that began 2 years after a man's death under unclear circumstances continues, outlasting the circumstances and the woman and the man alike. Shangri-La, in Honolulu, is a public-facing center for Islamic arts and cultures, operated by the Shangri-La Museum of Islamic Art, Culture and Design, in partnership with the Doris Duke Foundation. The collection, the Iznik tiles, the Mughal textiles, the Syrian interiors, is available to scholars and visitors. The house that Duke built to contain her fascination with Islamic art now serves a broader fascination. The private became public, the personal became institutional. The Doris Duke Foundation reports assets exceeding $2 billion. The money that J.B. Duke extracted from American tobacco and Doris Duke converted into art, land, and architecture continues to circulate through the system she designed. The institutional life of the fortune is, by any reasonable measure, a success. And Eduardo Tirella is dead. He has been dead since October 7, 1966. He was a veteran, a designer, a man with ambitions of his own, and he died outside the gates of a mansion belonging to a woman whose wealth was large enough to shape the investigation into his death, the civic memory of his death, and the physical landscape on which his death occurred. The official file says accident. The civil court said negligence. The later reporting said murder. The criminal justice system said nothing, because it was never asked to speak. Doris Duke built institutions that function. She preserved land that would otherwise have been developed. She saved buildings that would otherwise have been demolished. She assembled collections that enrich the public understanding of Islamic art and Gilded Age material culture. These contributions are documented, substantial, and ongoing. They are not erased by the darkness in her biography, and the darkness is not erased by them. The woman who learned, at 12, that money reorganizes every human relationship it touches, spent the rest of her life living inside that reorganization. She married twice, and both marriages dissolved. She adopted a daughter and revoked the arrangement. She employed a designer who became her closest collaborator and who died under disputed circumstances at the moment he tried to leave. She entrusted her final care and her estate's execution to a butler whose authority over her life expanded as her capacity contracted. Each of these relationships followed the same structural logic. Intimacy entered through the door that money opened, and when the relationship strained, money, in the form of settlements, bequests, foundations, or silence, absorbed the consequences. The gate at Rough Point still stands. The car is gone. The road has been repaved. The tree across Bellevue Avenue has been replaced or has grown beyond recognition. But the gate is there, and behind it, the house is a museum. And inside the museum, the rooms are arranged, and the arrangement is partly Eduardo Tirella's work. And the man who did the work is not there to see it. And the woman who owned the house is not there to explain what happened outside it. And the official record says one thing, and the investigative record says another, and the distance between them is the distance that money, Eli status, and time can place between an event and its reckoning. Both things were true. Doris Duke was a builder whose institutions outlast her, and she was also the woman at the wheel when Eduardo Tirella died. She was a preservationist whose philanthropy reshaped a city, and she was also the patron whose generosity arrived in that city at the precise moment when generosity could do the most to quiet the most dangerous questions. She was a collector of extraordinary taste and seriousness, and she was also a woman whose final room narrowed to a suite, a butler, an allegation of sedation, and a billion-dollar will that no one around her could be trusted to execute without a court's supervision. The houses remember what the houses were built to hold. They do not remember what happened at the gate, or in the last room, or in the space between a woman and the people she drew close, and then could not keep. That is not what houses are for. Houses hold objects, preserve surfaces, and present arrangements. The rest, the weight of what was done, and what was left undone, and what can no longer be settled, belongs to the record, and to the gap the record cannot close,